The rain came in sideways off Casco Bay, the kind of November rain that didn't fall so much as attack driving against the windows of Hargrove House for children, with a persistence that felt almost personal, as though the weather itself had decided this particular building deserved special punishment. Inside on the third floor, an 18-year-old girl was scrubbing grout with a toothbrush. Her name was Iris Calloway. She had lived in this building for 13 years. She had scrubbed this particular bathroom floor more times than she could count. Always with this same toothbrush. Always with the same bleach gray water that turned her fingers raw and red by the second hour. The dress she wore had belonged to at least 4 girls before her. It hung loose on her thin frame, shapeless and pale, like something a ghost might wear, if ghosts needed to keep up appearances. This was her life. Not a bad life, exactly. Not the kind of life that showed bruises. Just the kind that left marks you couldn't see, the slow accumulation of being nobody's first choice. Nobody's emergency contact. Nobody's reason to drive through the rain on a Tuesday. She had learned to measure herself by usefulness. She scrubbed. She cooked. She helped the younger children with their homework, and didn't complain when the heating in the basement room cut out in January. She made herself indispensable because indispensable was the closest thing to wanted that she had ever found. The state had declared her an adult 3 months ago. 18 meant the system's obligation ended. 18 meant the world expected you to have somewhere to go. Iris had nowhere. Dorothy Finch, the director of Hargrove House, had allowed her to stay in exchange for work, not out of warmth, but out of the particular calculus of institutional kindness, which was really just a more honest version of need. They needed someone to do the things nobody else wanted to do. Iris needed a roof. The arrangement required no affection from either party. Under the thin mattress in her basement room in a cardboard box that contained everything she owned in the world, there was a stack of college applications. She filled them out each night by the light of a small flashlight, careful not to wake the 2 younger girls who slept in the room above her. She wrote about resilience. She wrote about determination. She wrote the things she knew. Admissions committees wanted to read, because she had learned early that the truth that she was simply trying to escape was not a story anyone wanted to sponsor. She was reaching into the bucket of gray water for the 3rd time when the bathroom door crashed open. Dorothy Finch stood in the doorway. Iris had known this woman for 13 years. She had seen her angry, tired, disappointed, in the particular way that came from managing too many children with too little money for too many decades. She had never seen her afraid. But that was what Iris recognized now on Dorothy Finch's face. A pale, tight, barely controlled fear that made the older woman look suddenly small inside her own clothing. "Downstairs," Dorothy said. Her voice cracked on the word. "Now, wash your hands first." Iris stood slowly. The cold pressure in her chest was familiar, the physical sensation of waiting for something bad to arrive. She scrubbed her hands under the tap water so cold her teeth ached, and followed the director down the creaking stairs. The foyer of Hargrove House had not changed in the years she had lived there. The same water-stained wallpaper. The same bare overhead bulb that turned everyone's face a shade of institutional yellow. The same portrait of the building's founder hanging above the entrance, rendered in oil paint that had darkened with age until the subject's expression was nearly impossible to read, which somehow felt appropriate. The man standing in the center of that worn floor did not belong there. He was tall and silver-haired, somewhere in his mid-60s, with posture that announced without arrogance that he had spent his life in rooms far more impressive than this one. His suit was charcoal gray cut with the kind of precision that made cheap clothing look like a personal failing by comparison. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine that caught the dim light and held it. The leather briefcase in his hand was the kind of object that communicated net worth without saying a word. He turned when Iris reached the bottom of the stairs. His eyes were sharp and assessing the eyes of a man whose profession required him to evaluate people quickly and accurately. He looked at her chapped hands, her second-hand dress, her hair pulled back with a rubber band she had found on the sidewalk. He did not look at her with pity. That was what she noticed first, because pity was the default expression of most adults who visited Hargrove House. This man looked at her the way a navigator looks at a map, with focus, with purpose, with the understanding that getting this right mattered. Miss Iris Calloway. His voice was measured and precise. Yes, sir. My name is Sterling Aldrich. I am senior partner at Aldrich, Baxter and Associates. I represent the estate of Walter Ashford. The name meant nothing to her. She looked at Dorothy Finch, but the director had pressed herself against the wall, with her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone white. I'm sorry, Iris said. I don't know who that is. Sterling Aldrich reached into his briefcase. He withdrew a photograph, old and slightly faded, its edges worn soft from handling. He held it toward her. Iris took it. The woman in the photograph was beautiful in the way that photographs from 20 years ago sometimes captured beauty, unguarded, genuine, caught in a moment of real joy. Dark hair past her shoulders, head tilted back in laughter at something beyond the frame. And in her arms, a baby. Iris stopped breathing. She knew this photograph. She had her own version of it, smaller, more faded, tucked beneath her mattress in that cardboard box. In her version, only the woman and the baby were visible. But this version was wider. This version showed someone standing beside the woman, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. An older man, stern jaw, eyes that were difficult to read, but held something in them that looked, if you looked carefully enough, like love. That is your mother, Sterling Aldrich said quietly. Claire Ashford. The man beside her is your grandfather, Walter Ashford. He passed away 9 days ago. You are named in his will. The room tilted slightly. Iris steadied herself with one hand on the banister. Her mother had never mentioned family. The social workers who processed her case after Claire died had told her with the efficient compassion of people delivering news they had delivered many times before that her mother had no living relatives, that Iris was truly alone, that the system would take care of her now. They had been wrong, or they had not known, or someone had not wanted them to know. My mother's name was Calloway, Iris said carefully. She never told me about a grandfather. Your mother changed her name when she left home, Aldrich said. She was estranged from her father for many years. The reasons are complicated, and I'll explain what I can on the drive. But right now, Miss Calloway, I need you to come with me. The reading of the will is this afternoon. Iris looked at the photograph in her hands one more time. The laughing woman, the baby, the old man whose expression she was only now learning to read. All right, she said. She didn't go back for the cardboard box. There wasn't time. She carried what she had, the second-hand dress, the rubber band in her hair, and one new fact. that somewhere in the architecture of her life, there had been a door she hadn't known existed, and it had just swung open. The car was a black Mercedes interior, smelling of leather and climate control, and the particular silence of expensive things. Iris sat in the back and watched Maine dissolve through the tinted window. Portland giving way to suburbs, suburbs giving way to farmland, farmland giving way to the dense coastal forest of the mid-coast region. They drove north. The rain had not let up. If anything, it had grown more committed. Your grandfather founded Ashford Atlantic Shipping 58 years ago, Sterling Aldrich said from the front seat. He spoke without turning around as though delivering a briefing. It began as a small coastal freight operation out of Portland. By the time your mother was born, it had become one of the largest maritime shipping enterprises on the eastern seaboard. The company's current holdings are substantial. Why did my mother leave? The question had been building pressure since the moment she'd seen the photograph. Her mother had never spoken of family, not once, not even in the vague, careful way that people sometimes spoke of things too painful to address directly. Claire Calloway had lived as though she had arrived in the world without a past, without connections, without anyone preceding her. Aldrich was quiet for a long moment. Your grandfather was a man who believed in control, he said finally. He believed that loyalty meant obedience. Your mother had her own ideas about how she wanted to live. When she was 22, she left. She took nothing with her except the clothes on her back. Walter never forgave her. But he remembered me in his will. Yes. Why, if he never forgave her? That, Aldrich said, is something I cannot fully answer. But I believe the answer is somewhere inside that house. The car turned off the main road onto a private drive, marked by a gate of wrought iron standing open as though expecting them. A gravel path curved through a stand of ancient oaks, whose branches had grown into each other over decades, forming a canopy overhead that blocked what little light the clouds permitted. And then the trees parted. Iris had grown up in institutional spaces rooms designed for efficiency, not beauty. Buildings that communicated function over everything else. She had no reference point for what she was looking at now. Ashford Point Manor rose from the cliffs above the ocean, like something that had always been there, and simply allowed a house to be built around it. Stone walls the color of old pewter, windows arranged in rows along 3 full stories, their glass catching the gray afternoon light. Towers at the eastern and western corners. A roofline broken by chimneys that rose at intervals like punctuation marks in an ancient text. And behind it all, barely visible through the coastal mist, the Atlantic crashed against the granite below, with a sound like distant artillery. The building did not look welcoming. It looked like it had opinions about who deserved to enter. Iris had the uncomfortable feeling that it was forming one about her right now. Ashford Point Manor, Aldrich said. Your grandfather built it 41 years ago. It has been the family seat ever since. Iris said nothing. She was still looking at the windows. Inside the entrance hall was the size of the entire ground floor of Hargrove House. Crystal chandeliers hung from painted ceilings. Marble floors reflected her worn shoes back at her. Oil portraits lined the walls, men and women with the same strong jaw. The same watchful eyes rendered across what appeared to be multiple generations. Her family, she understood. These were her ancestors. She did not know a single face. They did not look like people who would have been glad to claim her. Sterling Aldrich led her through corridors until they reached a pair of heavy doors carved with the image of a ship at sea. He paused with one hand on the brass handle. "Before we go in," he said, his voice dropping, "there are things you should know. Your grandfather had one other child, a daughter named Vivian. She is still living along with her husband and her son from a prior marriage. They were expecting to be the primary beneficiaries of the estate. And they won't be." Aldrich's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The will contains provisions they were not anticipating. I can't tell you more than that right now. But I want you to be prepared. The next hour may be difficult." He opened the doors. The library beyond was enormous. Its walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books that had the appearance of never having been opened, collected for their gravity rather than their content. A stone fireplace large enough to stand in roared at the far end. And arranged in leather chairs, before that fire were three people who turned to look at Iris, with expressions she read immediately and accurately because she had spent her entire life learning to read rooms. The woman was striking in the particular way of someone who had spent serious money on the project of herself. Blonde hair pulled back so severely, it seemed to pull the skin of her face taut. Diamonds at her throat, her ears, her fingers not worn, but deployed each piece a statement. She was dressed entirely in black, but it was not mourning black. It was the black of someone who understood that color communicated power and had chosen accordingly. She was somewhere in her early 50s, and she carried herself with the particular confidence of a person who had never seriously considered the possibility of not getting what she wanted. Beside her sat a man of similar age, with the softened look of someone who had once been substantial and had gradually yielded that quality to circumstance. He glanced up from his phone when Iris entered, registered her presence with minimal interest, and looked back down. In a chair beside the window, one leg draped over the armrest, with the casual arrogance of someone who had decided the rules of furniture didn't apply to him, sat a young man in his mid-20s, dark-haired, sharp-featured, handsome, in the way that certain faces are handsome before the character behind them becomes apparent. He looked at Iris with a smirk that suggested he had already decided who she was and found the answer unimpressive. The woman spoke first, Sterling. Her voice was soft and controlled and dangerous in the way that very quiet things sometimes are. "We've been waiting for over an hour. I would like to settle my father's affairs so I can begin making arrangements for the estate." "My apologies for the delay, Vivian," Aldrich said smoothly. "There was a necessary party who required collecting." Vivian Ashford Crane's eyes moved to Iris. They traveled slowly, deliberately. Shoes to dress to hands to face, like an appraiser cataloging damage. "And who," she said, "is this?" "This is Iris Calloway. She is necessary for the reading of the will." The young man by the window laughed. It was not a kind sound. "Is she the new help? Did grandfather finally replace the last housekeeper who quit?" "Sit down, Miss Calloway," Aldrich said. He gestured toward a chair apart from the others. "Let us begin." Iris sat. She placed her hands flat on her knees and fixed her expression into something neutral. She had learned this skill at Hargrove House, the ability to occupy a room without giving anyone in it the satisfaction of knowing what you were actually feeling. Aldrich moved to the head of the room. He set his briefcase on the oak desk, opened it, and withdrew a thick document sealed with red wax. The sound of the seal breaking carried through the silence like a small gunshot. He began to read. There were the expected provisions: donations to maritime charities, instructions for the care of the property, bequests to longtime staff members who were named individually and with what appeared to be genuine regard. And then Aldrich's voice shifted, not in volume, not dramatically, but in the weight it carried. Something changed in his delivery that made even the young man by the window sit up straighter. To my daughter Vivian Ashford Crane, I leave the sum of $600,000 to be paid in a single installment upon settlement of my estate. This bequest is conditional upon her agreement to make no contest to any other provision of this will. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Vivian's face had gone white. Not pale white, the color of something from which all warmth has been suddenly and completely extracted. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair. 600,000, she said. The words came out barely above a whisper. That is my monthly household budget sterling. Where's the rest? The company, the portfolio, this house? Aldrich continued as though she had not spoken. To my grandson Preston Crane, I leave my collection of 14 vintage automobiles currently housed in the north garage of the estate, with an estimated combined value of $2.7 million. Preston unfolded himself from the chair. His smirk had collapsed entirely. Cars. He left me cars. He promised me the trust. He specifically told me, and finally, Aldrich paused. He looked directly at Iris. To my granddaughter Iris Calloway, daughter of my beloved Claire. The room erupted. Vivian was on her feet. The man beside her, Douglas Crane, her husband, had finally set down his phone. Preston took 2 steps forward as though he might physically intervene in the reading of a legal document. Granddaughter. Vivian's voice had abandoned its careful softness entirely. Claire's child. She told us that baby died. She stood in this house, and she told us. Miss Calloway is very much alive, Aldrich said with a steadiness that Iris found remarkable. And Mr. Ashford's instructions are unambiguous. To Iris Calloway, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including all shares in Ashford Atlantic Shipping Company, all investment portfolios, all international holdings, and Ashford Point Manor, together with all associated land and structures. The total estimated value of this bequest is $3.9 billion. $3.9 billion. The number existed in the room the way large geological facts exist, too big to hold, too real to dismiss. Iris sat completely still and thought about the flashlight she used to fill out college applications. She thought about the toothbrush she had been using to scrub grout 3 hours ago. She thought about the cardboard box under her mattress that contained everything she owned. $3.9 billion. This is fraud. Vivian's voice had returned colder now and more deliberate. You produced this girl from nowhere, sterling. She's an instrument. Someone put her up to this, and when I prove it, the will is properly executed and witnessed, Aldrich said. Its provisions are legally binding. However, he paused. There is a condition. Vivian stopped. Her eyes sharpened. What condition? Aldrich looked at Iris, and something passed across his face that she couldn't quite read. Not sympathy, not warning. Something that sat uncomfortably between those two things. Mr. Ashford was concerned that his granddaughter might be unprepared for the responsibilities of an estate of this size. Therefore, the will stipulates that she must reside at Ashford Point Manor for a period of 6 consecutive months. She may not leave the property for more than 24 hours at a time. And during this probationary period, Vivian Douglas and Preston Crane must be permitted to remain in residence. The words landed in Iris's mind one by one like stones dropped into still water. 6 months. In this house. With these people. If Miss Calloway fails to complete the 6-month residency, Aldrich continued, or if she dies before the period concludes, the entire estate reverts to Vivian Ashford Crane. The word dies sat in the sentence like something that had been placed there deliberately. Iris felt it. Vivian had stopped screaming. The fury had drained from her face and been replaced by something far more controlled, far more dangerous. She was smiling. It was a smile that had never visited her eyes, a computational expression. The kind that appears on a face when a problem has just revealed a solution. She looked at Iris with pale blue eyes that had gone completely flat. 6 months, she said softly. She tilted her head slightly, the way a bird tilts its head when it has identified something of interest. Well then, welcome to the family, little bird. I imagine we're going to have a fascinating time together. They gave Iris a room in the east wing. It was larger than any space she had ever occupied. 4-poster bed draped in deep blue velvet French doors, opening onto a balcony that faced the ocean. An unlit fireplace in the corner that looked like it hadn't been lit in years. The furniture was antique and beautiful, and gave the impression of belonging to someone else, which was accurate. Sterling Aldrich left within the hour. On his way out, he pressed a cheap prepaid phone into Iris's hand, keeping the gesture low so the others wouldn't see. My private number is saved in that phone, he said quietly. Day or night. Call if you need anything. Why are you helping me? She asked. Why did you come for me specifically? He looked at her for a moment with those sharp, unreadable eyes. Then he was gone, and she was standing alone in the corridor with a cheap phone in her hand, and no answer to the only question that mattered. She found the photographs in her room that evening. They were everywhere, on the dresser, the nightstand, the shelves of a small bookcase in the corner. A girl growing up in this house, captured in stages 5 years old on a horse far too big for her. 10 standing in the manor's garden in summer, laughing at something the photographer had said. 15 formal and composed at what appeared to be a charity dinner. 19 holding a diploma, eyes bright with something that looked like relief as much as pride. Claire Ashford growing up in the house where Iris now stood. Happy in every photograph. Surrounded by all of it, the wealth, the space, the certainty of being wanted and placed and known. And then she had walked away from every single bit of it, changed her name, and never looked back. Why? Iris moved through the room, slowly touching the things her mother might have touched. The silver hairbrush on the vanity, the worn spine of a poetry collection on the nightstand, the velvet curtains that framed the windows like something theatrical, and then behind the wardrobe a massive piece of furniture that nearly reached the ceiling. The kind built to stay in one place permanently. She found it. Wedged into the narrow space between the wardrobe's back and the wall, invisible unless you were specifically looking, was a leather journal. Its cover was cracked with age. She pulled it out carefully, afraid it might come apart in her hands. The pages inside were her mother's handwriting. She recognized it from the birthday cards Claire had pressed into her hands when she was small. Looping and elegant, the script of someone who had been taught penmanship as a social skill. She sat on the edge of the bed and began to read. The early entries were ordinary. School, friends, small grievances with large domestic staff. The low-stakes dramas of a protected and wealthy childhood. But as the dates advanced, the handwriting changed. The letters grew smaller, more compressed, as though Claire were trying to fit more words onto each page before someone could arrive and stop her. The final entry was dated 18 years ago, a few weeks before Iris was born. Iris read it slowly in the failing afternoon light from the balcony doors, with the sound of the Atlantic coming up from the cliffs below. Her mother had found files in Walter Ashford's study, not looking for them. Looking for her own birth certificate for hospital paperwork. But what she'd found instead was something she'd called Project Leviathan. She'd found records, financial records, shipping logs, photographs. Evidence that for more than 20 years, Ashford Atlantic had been operating a secondary business alongside its legitimate cargo operations. Chemical companies paid the fleet to dispose of industrial waste toxic materials that required expensive licensed handling by simply taking the barrels out to sea and pushing them overboard. The Caribbean, the Pacific, waters off the coasts of nations whose governments lacked either the resources or the will to investigate. Villages where people were getting sick. Children born with defects. Communities quietly destroyed for the convenience of corporations that needed their waste to disappear, and found a willing partner in Walter Ashford's ships. Claire had confronted her father. He'd told her she would destroy everything he'd built. He'd told her no one would believe a 22-year-old woman with no evidence and no stand-in against a 50-year-old company. And then, Vivian had come to her room. Not with threats, the journal was specific about this. Vivian was too careful for direct threats. She had simply sat and talked about accidents, about how easy it was for things to go wrong when people made certain choices. She had looked at Claire's pregnant stomach the entire time she was speaking. The last lines of the entry were smaller than anything that preceded them, pressed into the paper, with a force that had left faint impressions on the page beneath. I'm leaving tonight. I'm taking nothing that connects me to this family. I'll disappear. If you find this father, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't fix what's broken here. But I have to protect my daughter. I have to protect her from what they'll do to keep this secret. They will kill me if I stay. Iris set the journal down on the bed beside her. She sat for a long time with her hands in her lap, listening to the ocean below and the house settling around her and the distant sound of voices from the west wing where Vivian and her family had their rooms. She thought about her mother, the woman in the photograph, laughing, full of light, carrying an unborn child she was already willing to sacrifice everything to protect. She thought about what it meant that she was now sitting in that woman's childhood bedroom, in that woman's house, surrounded by that woman's enemies. Her mother had run, and 13 years later, on a dark stretch of highway south of Portland, something had caught up with her. Iris understood now in the way you understand something. When the last piece of a picture finally arrives and the image becomes undeniable that she was not here by accident. She was not here because of a grandfather's belated guilt. She was here because someone had decided she should be here in this house, with these people under conditions that guaranteed she would be isolated and vulnerable for 6 consecutive months. The condition of the will that had seemed like an eccentricity was not an eccentricity at all. It was a mechanism. She picked up the cheap phone that Sterling Aldrich had given her and held it for a long time without calling anyone because she already understood something else. The man who had handed her this phone had also signed those documents. Whatever role he was playing, it had more than one face. Outside, the Atlantic continued its conversation with the granite far below. It was not a gentle sound. It never was this far north this late in the year. It was the sound of something enormous and indifferent, working against stone that had once seemed permanent. Iris sat in her dead mother's room and thought about the 6 months ahead of her, and about the cardboard box she had left behind at Hargrove House, with its stack of college applications that nobody was going to read. Then she stood up. She straightened her second-hand dress. She looked at the last photograph of her mother on the nightstand 20 years old, laughing on this very balcony, the Atlantic behind her. The whole world apparently still possible. She picked up the journal and tucked it carefully under the mattress of the four-poster bed, beside the brass key she had not yet found, and the truth she had not yet uncovered, both of which were waiting for her in the specific darkness that lies between knowing something is wrong and knowing exactly how wrong it is. Tomorrow she would begin to find out. The first week at Ashford Point Manor taught Iris 3 things about the people she was living with. The first thing she learned was that Vivian Ashford Crane was patient, in the way that certain predators are patient not because they lack urgency, but because they understand that timing is everything. In the days following the reading of the will, Vivian did not scream or threaten. She did not slam doors or make speeches. Instead, she treated Iris with a cold and flawless courtesy that was somehow more unsettling than open hostility. She smiled at dinner. She asked polite questions about what it had been like to grow up at Hargrove House, questions that contained embedded within their apparent sympathy a precise and surgical inventory of everything Iris lacked. She behaved in front of the remaining household staff like a concerned aunt, welcoming a long-lost niece back into the fold. But when they were alone in a hallway, passing on the stairs in the brief moments when no one else was watching, Vivian turned it off completely. The warmth, the questions, the careful performance of familial concern. She turned it off the way you turn off a light switch, and what remained in the darkness was nothing. Just those pale blue eyes, flat and assessing, doing the continuous quiet work of someone who has already decided on an outcome and is simply waiting for the right moment to produce it. The second thing Iris learned was that Preston Crane had none of his mother's patience and all of her contempt. He followed her through the corridors of the manor, always appearing around corners just as she turned them, always somehow ahead of her on the stairs, when she was coming down, and behind her when she was going up. He made remarks that occupied the careful territory between threat and joke, designed to be deniable if challenged, designed to land regardless. He watched her eat with an intensity that made food feel complicated. One evening near the end of the first week, he stepped into the library doorway just as she was reaching for it, his arm across the frame like a gate. "You know what I think about every time I look at you," he said. She waited. "I think about what grandfather must have been like in those last months. Sick, confused, sentimental, looking for some way to feel like he'd done something good before the end." He smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had decided cruelty was a form of honesty. You're not an inheritance. You're a guilt offering, and guilt offerings don't last. Iris looked at his arm across the doorway. Then she looked at his face. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I'd like to use the library." He held the position for 3 more seconds, long enough to make his point, and then stepped aside. She walked past him without changing her pace or her expression, found the chair she wanted and sat down with a book she didn't read for the next hour, while she waited for her hands to stop shaking where he couldn't see them. The third thing she learned about Douglas Crane was that he was different from the others in ways she hadn't initially understood. He was a quiet man by disposition, content to exist in the periphery of his wife's considerable force field. Present at meals, but seldom contributing to them, his attention apparently absorbed by his phone, or whatever newspaper had been delivered that morning. She had taken him for a weak man, the kind who had married into circumstances well beyond his own gravity and had been slowly ground down by the weight of it, until what remained was just an outline of a person going through the familiar motions of a life he no longer quite inhabited. She revised this assessment on the 5th night. She had gone down to the kitchen after midnight, a habit from Hargrove House, where the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning had always felt like the only time that truly belonged to her. The kitchen at Ashford Point was a vast industrial space designed for a household staff of a dozen that no longer existed, its stainless surfaces gleaming faintly in the low emergency lighting. She found crackers in the pantry and was standing at the counter eating them without tasting them when Douglas appeared in the doorway. He looked like a man who had not slept in several days. His tie was loosened. The jacket was gone. His silver hair was disheveled in a way that suggested he had been running his hands through it repeatedly for hours. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her, and then he said something she had not expected. "Don't eat the eggs tomorrow morning." Iris set the cracker down. "Vivian has asked the cook to prepare eggs for breakfast," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper, and he did not move from the doorway as though proximity to this conversation needed to be maintained at minimum. "She's had something added to them. Not enough to cause serious harm, just enough to make you ill, confused, too sick to pay attention to what's happening around you." The familiar cold pressure built in Iris's chest. She had felt it every day since arriving here. The physical sensation of being in a place where the danger was real but unspecified, where every surface was potentially a surface being managed by someone else's calculation. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Douglas moved to the kitchen table and sat down heavily like a man whose legs had been making a decision about this for some time. He looked at his hands. "Because my wife goes further than she should," he said. "She always has. And because I made a promise to your grandfather before he died." "You spoke to him before he died." "Several times in his final weeks. He knew what was coming. He knew what Vivian would do when she understood the will. He asked me to look after you." Douglas looked up. "I told him I would try." Iris studied him, the exhausted eyes, the loosened collar, the hands that weren't quite still on the table. She was not certain he was telling the truth. She was not certain he was lying. She was certain that the two conditions were not mutually exclusive. "If you want to help me," she said carefully, "tell me what Project Leviathan is." The color left his face so completely and so quickly that it was almost theatrical. He glanced at the kitchen door, then back at her, and the calculation she saw moving behind his eyes in that moment told her more than any expression he could have deliberately composed. "I can't tell you that directly," he said. "But there are things in this house that Vivian doesn't know about. Things your grandfather kept hidden even from her." Where? He hesitated. His hands pressed flat against the table. Then he leaned forward. "The library. Find the book called Moby Dick. Third shelf from the fireplace left side. Your grandfather spent a great deal of time with that book in his final months." He paused. He wanted to be certain the right person would find what he left inside it. He pushed himself up from the table and turned toward the door. Then he stopped. "Be careful, Iris. Vivian is not the kind of woman who accepts losing. And she has decided very clearly, very specifically, that losing to you is not something she's willing to consider." He left. She listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor, growing quieter until there was nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the ocean working against the cliffs. She stood in the kitchen for a long time after that, the cracker dissolving to powder in her hand. She found the book the following afternoon. Moby Dick. Heavy, battered cover spine cracked with age, wedged between volumes of maritime law and naval history, exactly where Douglas had said it would be. She pulled it from the shelf. It was lighter than it should have been. She opened it and understood why. The pages had been carved out, not roughly, but with patience and precision, creating a hollow at the book's center, roughly the size of a paperback novel. Someone had spent considerable time on this. Someone who had understood that the things most worth hiding are often hidden best in plain sight, inside the objects that announce themselves most loudly. Resting in the hollow were two things. The first was a small brass key, green with age, attached to a length of leather cord. The second was a folded piece of paper covered in handwriting she didn't recognize. Deliberate and slightly unsteady, the handwriting of someone old and ill and aware of both conditions. She unfolded it carefully. "Iris, if you are reading this, I am gone. I hope you will forgive an old man for the mistakes that kept him from doing what was right while he still had time to do it. I should have looked for you years ago. I should have brought you home after Claire died. Instead, I let pride and shame make my decisions, and the cost of that is something I will not be able to repay. You are surrounded by people who will tell you they loved me. They loved what I could give them. When I threatened to take that away, I learned who they actually were. Your mother found the truth about Project Leviathan. It cost her everything. I will not let it cost you the same. There is a door in the wine cellar. It was painted green once, though the paint has mostly gone. The key in this book will open it. Inside you will find everything you need to understand what this family has done and what is being done to protect it. Trust carefully, Iris. Not everyone who offers help is offering only help. Survive. And when you are ready, use what you find. Your grandfather, Walter." She read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it and placed it in her pocket with the key. She put the hollow book back in its place on the shelf exactly as she had found it, and walked out of the library without looking at anyone. The wine cellar. Tonight. She waited until 2 in the morning. The manor was quiet in the way that very old houses are quiet. Not silent, but layered with sounds that belong to the building itself. Wood settling. Pipes contracting in the cold. The occasional groan of something deep in the structure that had been supporting weight for 40 years and was commenting on the experience. She moved down the main staircase with her hand on the wall, avoiding the steps she had already memorized as unreliable. The kitchen was dark and cold. The cellar door, heavy steel more suited to a vault than a household storage space, was at the far end, and she pulled it open slowly, the hinges protesting in a tone she absorbed into her held breath, and descended. The temperature dropped with every step. By the time her feet reached the stone floor at the bottom, she could see her own breath. She had brought a small flashlight from her room, and its beam opened a narrow corridor through absolute darkness. The wine cellar was far larger than she had anticipated. Stone passages stretched in multiple directions lined on both sides with wooden racks holding thousands of bottles, the accumulated evidence of decades of wealth that expressed itself among other ways in the patient acquisition of things that improved with waiting. The air smelled of cold stone and something metallic she couldn't identify. Dust covered everything. The silence was the particular silence of underground spaces, the kind that feels pressurized as though it has been compressed by the weight of everything above it. She moved deeper into the labyrinth, following the passages toward what her internal sense of the building's geography suggested was its furthest point. She was looking for any door that might once have been painted green. She found it at the end of the longest corridor behind a stack of empty wooden crates that had not been moved in years. She could tell by the way dust had accumulated around their bases, in small, perfect ridges, the kind that only form when objects remain completely undisturbed over long periods of time. The door behind them was iron, heavy and rusted. Whatever green had once covered its surface had faded to a mottled gray-brown that was easy to overlook if you weren't specifically searching. She pulled the brass key from her pocket and fitted it to the lock. It resisted. She gripped the key with both hands and turned with everything she had. Metal moved against metal. Something internal to the mechanism objected loudly, then gave way entirely. The door swung open. The room beyond was small and windowless, with the particular stillness of a space that had been sealed and left. A single desk occupied the center, buried under files and papers. Filing cabinets lined one wall. On the opposite wall, maps and nautical charts had been pinned in overlapping layers, shipping routes marked in different colors, dates written in small, precise numbers beside port names she didn't recognize. She stepped inside and began to read. What she read over the next hour was the kind of thing that changes the temperature of a room. Ashford Atlantic Shipping had built its reputation on legitimate cargo, and its fortune for more than 2 decades on something else entirely. Project Leviathan was the name Walter Ashford had given in internal documents to a secondary revenue stream that operated in the negative spaces of the company's legitimate operations. Chemical manufacturers, large ones, names she recognized from labels on ordinary household products, paid Ashford Atlantic to make industrial waste disappear. The waste in question was toxic. It required expensive license treatment and disposal under federal environmental law. What Ashford Atlantic offered was a simpler solution. Cargo ships with wide decks and long routes and captains who understood that certain instructions were never written down. The barrels went out full. They came back empty. There were photographs. Loading docks in the Gulf Coast in New Jersey and Massachusetts. Barrels stacked and roped and covered with tarps on the decks of ships whose official manifests listed different cargo entirely. The same barrels being pushed from the rails of those ships into open water. The Caribbean, the Pacific coastal waters off islands and peninsulas, whose governments either lacked the capacity or the incentive to investigate. And there were the reports that followed. Medical assessments from fishing communities in the Caribbean and Central America. Studies of fish mortality and water contamination. Documentation of illness rates that rose in the years following certain routes. Children. Liver disease. Neurological damage. The slow, quiet destruction of communities that had no context for what was happening to them, and no mechanism for addressing it. Iris sat at the desk and read through it all with the methodical focus of someone who understood that the only way through material, this large and this terrible, was one page at a time. She was near the bottom of the largest stack when she found the authorization forms. They were signed documents, approval records for individual disposal operations, each one authorizing a specific shipment, naming the cargo company, the route, the date. She went through them one by one. The signatures were consistent, not Walter Ashford's. The handwriting was different, controlled, and decisive, the signature of someone who signed things quickly, because they signed many things. Vivian Ashford Crane. Vivian had not inherited this operation. She had run it. For 20 years, while Walter Ashford's name was on the company letterhead, his daughter had been managing the secondary business, signing the authorizations, coordinating the payments, making the calls. Walter had either not known or not wanted to know, and Iris wasn't yet certain which was worse. Below each of Vivian's signatures was a witness signature. Sterling Aldrich, the man who had come to Hargrove House to bring her here. The man who had pressed a phone into her hand and told her to call if she needed anything. The man whose name was also on the building where she had spent 13 years of her life. A fact she had assumed was coincidence, and now understood was nothing of the kind. She was still sitting with this understanding, turning it over, examining its edges when the lights went out. The darkness was instantaneous and complete. She reached for the flashlight, but her hands were not steady, and it fell, and the sound of it hitting the stone floor was followed by the sound of it rolling somewhere she couldn't track. Then she heard the door. The heavy iron door moved on its hinges slowly. The way something moves when it is being controlled by someone who wants to be quiet about it, and closed with a sound that was not loud, but was final. The lock engaged. One solid click, and then silence. She was across the room in 3 steps, both hands flat against the iron, pushing with everything she had. Nothing moved. "Let me out." Her voice was even. She was surprised by this. "I know what's in here. I know what you've been doing." Silence. Long enough that she thought the person on the other side had already walked away. And then Vivian's voice came through the iron quiet, almost conversational, carrying the specific tone of someone who has rehearsed this moment and found the preparation unnecessary because the actual event is easier than anticipated. "You are so much like your mother, Iris." Claire was curious, too. She found this room. She read those files. She believed she could use what she'd learned. A pause. She couldn't. Iris pressed her back against the door and focused on her breathing. In through the nose, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. She had learned this technique at 12 years old during a winter when the heating at Hargrove House failed for 11 days, and panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. "You killed him," she said. "You killed Walter." "I did what the situation required." No heat in the voice, no defensiveness. The tone of someone reporting a decision they have made peace with. He was going to give everything away. To charity. To victims' funds. To lawyers who would have used it to dismantle everything I spent 20 years building. I could not allow that. And my mother. The silence this time was different. Waited. Claire's car had faulty brakes, Vivian said finally. It was a tragic accident. The police investigated thoroughly. These things happen especially on winter roads. You killed her. I protected my family. The voice was ice now, genuinely cold. The temperature it reached when the performance of reasonableness was no longer useful. Your mother was going to take everything from us. Destroy our reputation. Ruin the business. The livelihoods of thousands of people, all of it. For what? For fishing villages on islands that don't appear on any map that matters. Iris stood in the dark and absorbed this, the complete shape of it. Her mother had not died on a wet road because of a car that had been poorly maintained. Her grandfather had not died of a failing heart. These were not accidents or misfortunes or the indifferent workings of a world that didn't care about particular people. They were decisions. There is approximately 24 hours of air in that room. Vivian continued, her voice moving now, footsteps beginning slow and deliberate on stone. Perhaps less if you exert yourself. I'll return tomorrow evening to discover you. The story will be that you went exploring in the cellar alone, became disoriented, and accidentally locked yourself in an old storage room. A terrible accident. Everyone will be heartbroken. The footsteps continued. Sleep well, little bird. Give my regards to your mother when you see her. And then the sound of those footsteps faded and grew smaller and disappeared entirely. Iris stood in the absolute dark and counted her breaths. Panic is a physical thing. It begins in the stomach and travels upward, tightening as it rises until it reaches the throat and makes breathing feel like a skill you are only now attempting to acquire. She felt it begin its transit, and she did not pretend it wasn't there. She acknowledged it the way you acknowledge weather, present, significant, not the final word on the situation. She thought about Hargrove House in January, the cold rooms and the frozen pipes and 11 days of breath that showed in the air, because the heat was gone and no one was coming quickly enough to fix it. She had been 12. She had organized the younger children into groups and had them sleep in pairs for warmth, and had kept track of who was eating enough and who wasn't. And she had not stopped doing those things until the heat came back. She had not stopped. She stood up in the dark. The flashlight was somewhere on the floor. She moved carefully, 1 foot, testing each step before committing until her toe contacted something cylindrical that rolled slightly under her foot. She knelt and felt along the stone until her fingers closed around it. She pressed the switch. Nothing. The bulb had broken in the fall. No light. All right. She began to move around the perimeter of the room with both hands on the wall, building a picture through touch. The filing cabinets, the desk, the chair behind it. Stone walls rough and slightly damp. And on one wallpaper, many layers of it. The maps and charts she had seen when the light was still working. She moved her hands slowly across the paper surface, following the shapes her fingers found. Lines, curves, the drawn edges of coastlines and shipping routes. And then, at the far edge of one large chart, something that was not a coastline. a thin line almost tentative running from a point near where she estimated the back wall to be, to a small circle marked in faded ink near the edge of the paper. A drainage channel. She had grown up in an old building. She knew what drainage channels looked like on old architectural drawings, and she knew why they existed in underground spaces to carry water away from cellars during wet seasons through the stone, and eventually out to open air or to a drainage field. Ashford Point Manor sat on a cliff above the ocean. The drainage would have to go somewhere. She turned toward the back wall. It was covered in wood paneling. She could feel it under her hands. Smooth boards set close together. The kind of paneling installed to make a stone room feel less like a stone room. She pressed against it, solid. She pressed harder systematically, moving across the surface foot by foot. She stepped back, took the metal chair from behind the desk and swung it. The impact traveled up her arms and into her shoulders. The wood held. She swung again, harder, aiming for the same point. A crack. Not a break, a crack, the sound of old wood announcing that it was not as solid as it appeared. She swung again. Again. The sound changed on the fifth impact to something that had given it, and on the sixth her arms drove the chair leg through the paneling entirely, and cold air hit her face like water. Cold, damp, moving air. She tore at the wood around the hole with her hands, breaking pieces away, ignoring the splinters and the edges until the opening was wide enough for her shoulders. Behind the paneling was old brick, the original cellar wall predating the paneling by decades. The mortar between the bricks was soft with moisture and age. She used the broken chair leg as a tool, scraping at the mortar, pressing, working brick by brick until one came loose and then another. The air that came through was cold enough to hurt, and she breathed it like it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She worked for another 20 minutes until the opening was large enough. Then she got down on her hands and knees and she went into the dark. The drainage channel was narrow and ran downward at a gradual angle. The stone was wet and her clothing soaked through immediately. She moved on her hands and knees, and when the channel narrowed further, she moved on her elbows, pulling herself forward inch by inch in complete darkness. Unable to see ahead, unable to see behind, with only the faint movement of air on her face to confirm that there was an ahead at all. She thought about her mother. She thought about a woman who had been 22 years old and pregnant and frightened, and who had chosen to run rather than stay and fight, because staying seemed like dying. She had not blamed her mother for that reading the journal. She had understood it completely. But she was not 22 and pregnant, and alone with nothing but fear and the open road. She was 18 years old, and she had nothing, no money, no family, no allies she was certain of. She had grown up with nothing and survived it. She had been told her entire life that she was nobody, and she had refused in the particular quiet way of people who refuse things without making announcements to believe it. She kept moving. The light appeared gradually, not as a beam or a flash, but as a slow reduction of darkness, a gray quality entering the black that deepened by degrees into something she could perceive as directional. She moved toward it. Her elbows were raw. Her knees were soaked and cold. She didn't stop. The drainage channel terminated in a rusted metal grate that separated her from open air. Beyond the grate, she could see sky cloud, heavy and dark, but real sky with the particular grayness of a coastline night. She positioned herself as best she could in the narrow space and kicked. The grate groaned. She kicked again. On the third impact, it broke free of its corroded mounting and fell away. She pushed through the opening and found herself on a narrow ledge of granite 20 feet above the point where the cliff met the shore, with the Atlantic surging and retreating below her, and wind coming off the water with enough force to make standing a negotiation. She pressed herself against the stone and began to climb. The rock was slick. The wind pushed at her from the side. She climbed with the specific focus of someone who has no energy to spare for fear, pulling herself up crack by crack, handhold by handhold, until she reached the top of the cliff and rolled onto the wet grass of the manor's back garden and lay there on her back in the dark, breathing. She had the brass key in her pocket. She had Walter's letter. She had everything she had read in that room stored in the only place she was certain was secure, her own memory. And she had the growing concrete understanding that she could not run. The evidence was in that room. Vivian would move it or destroy it the moment she believed herself safe. Sterling Aldrich controlled the legal apparatus. The local police chief she had overheard Preston mention casually at dinner had been fishing with Sterling Aldrich every summer for 15 years. There was nowhere to run that would accomplish anything except keeping Iris alive while Vivian destroyed every piece of proof and walked away from all of it untouched. She sat up on the wet grass and looked at the manor above her. Its lit windows in the west wing where Vivian's rooms were its dark towers. Its enormous stone face that had looked at her with something like judgment on the day she arrived. And then she noticed the smaller light, not from the manor itself. From a low building near the east edge of the property, the groundskeeper's cottage. She had noted it in her first days here, without paying it much attention. A single window glowing with warm yellow light. A shadow moving inside. She got to her feet. She crossed the garden in the dark, keeping low, moving between the shapes of hedges and ornamental trees. The cottage was modest and weathered, the kind of structure that belongs to whoever does the actual physical work of maintaining a place like this. She stood outside the lit window for a moment, looking in. The man inside was somewhere in his late 40s, broad through the shoulders, gray-haired, moving with the particular economy of motion that belongs to people who have spent years in situations where unnecessary movement was a liability. He was standing at a small table looking at something she couldn't see from this angle. She knocked. The door opened almost before the sound of her knocking had finished. He looked at her, soaked through, scraped on both arms, a cut along her left cheekbone from a piece of broken wood she hadn't felt at the time. And his expression did not register surprise. It registered confirmation, the particular look of someone whose calculation has just proven accurate. "I was starting to wonder how much longer," he said. "Come inside. We have a great deal to talk about." His name was Marcus Reed. He had spent 22 years in naval special warfare before moving into private security executive protection. High-risk extractions. The kind of operational work where the only record kept is the one the client needs, and everything else stays quiet. Walter Ashford had found him 9 months before he died. He knew he was being poisoned, Marcus said. He had put coffee in front of her and taken the chair across the small table. He couldn't prove who, yet he had his suspicions, but nothing he could take anywhere. What he did know was that Vivian would move against you the moment she understood what the will contained. He needed someone on the property before you arrived. Someone whose presence could be explained. A groundskeeper. The previous one had retired 2 years ago. The position was legitimately vacant. It was a clean arrangement. Iris looked at him across the table. He watched me for 9 months, from a distance, making sure you weren't followed when you left Hargrove House, assessing what we were actually dealing with here before you walked into it. Marcus paused. He also needed events to unfold in a certain sequence. Walter believed that you needed to understand fully, not just intellectually, what you were fighting against before you'd have any real chance of winning. He could have just told me. He could have. But knowing something someone else tells you, and knowing something you've discovered yourself, are two different kinds of knowledge. Marcus set down his coffee. You've been in that room tonight. You've read those files. You've read what Vivian said to you through that door. No one told you any of that. You know it now in a way that can't be taken back. Iris thought about this. She admitted she killed my mother, she said. I know, I was monitoring. She said it like it was a business decision. To her it was. The cottage was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee and the faint residual cold of outdoor work. Outside, the wind was picking up off the water. Iris sat with her hands wrapped around the mug and felt the warmth work its way back into her fingers. The toxicology report, she said. I found it in that room. Walter was poisoned. Yes, there's enough in those files to end everything. The company, Vivian's freedom, Aldrich's career. All of it. Yes. But the files are locked in a room I can't get back into without being seen. The police chief is Aldrich's friend. The legal apparatus is Vivian's instrument. She looked at him directly. So what did Walter actually plan? Because a man who spent 9 months setting this up didn't set it up to end here. Marcus reached into the drawer of the small table beside him and placed a digital voice recorder on the surface between them. Your grandfather recorded his conversations with Vivian for 6 months, he said. Every meeting, every argument, every moment when she believed she was alone with a dying man who couldn't hurt her anymore. He paused, including the night she helped him die. Iris looked at the recorder. The original is locked in the safe in Walter's bedroom, Marcus continued. Biometric lock with a numeric backup. The backup code is your date of birth. He made certain you'd be the one who could open it. And if I get it out, this house has an internal broadcast system speakers in every room throughout the grounds. Your grandfather had it modified 3 months before he died. The modification connects it to an external frequency that the Maine State Police monitor as part of their emergency communications network. Marcus met her eyes. The moment that recording plays through the system, every state trooper within 50 miles hears it. Iris sat with this for a long moment. She thought about her mother, 22 years old, running down a dark highway with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a child she was determined to protect. She thought about what it had cost. The years. The life built out of nothing in a city where nobody knew her name. The dark road and the car, and the faulty brakes that were not faulty. She thought about Walter Ashford in his final months. Sick, isolated, the poison working through him while he spent whatever strength remained to him on this, on her. On the possibility that the daughter Claire had died protecting might be the one to finally make it right. She thought about herself, the girl who had spent 18 years being told in the 1,000 quiet ways that institutions tell children such things that she did not matter enough to fight for. She looked at Marcus read across the small table in the warm cottage, with the Atlantic working against the cliffs outside. "I'm not running," she said. He nodded slowly. There was something in his expression she recognized after a moment, the particular look of someone whose assessment has just been confirmed in a direction they were hoping for. "Then we go to work," he said. "Tonight." The plan was simple in the way that only genuinely dangerous things are simple. Marcus had spent 9 months learning Ashford Point Manor, the way a surgeon learns anatomy. Not just the visible structures, but the systems beneath them. The pathways and pressure points that determined how the whole thing functioned. He knew every entrance and exit. He knew which doors the household staff used and which ones had been locked since the previous decade. He knew the rhythm of the building at night when the last light went out in the west wing. How long after that the corridors remained uncertain, and when the house finally committed to sleep. He knew that tonight Vivian and Sterling Aldrich were in the west wing dining room. He had heard them through the exterior wall earlier in the evening, the particular register of voices that belonged to people celebrating something they believed was already finished. They thought Iris was in the cellar. They thought the problem had resolved itself with minimal effort on their part, which was exactly the kind of assumption that made careful people careless. There was a servant's passage that connected the groundskeeper's cottage to the main house. It had been built into the original structure when Ashford Point was constructed, designed for the practical movement of household workers through a building of this size without disrupting the family's experience of their own home. It ran behind walls and beneath floors accessible through a narrow door at the back of the cottage's storage room that had been plastered over at some point in the previous decade, and that Marcus had quietly reopened 3 months ago. "The passage brings us out in a linen closet on the second floor," he said. He had spread a hand-drawn floor plan on the table between them. 30 feet from the master bedroom. The safe is behind the painting on the east wall. A seascape large, heavy frame. Biometric scanner, primary, numeric keypad, secondary. "My birthday," Iris said. "Month, day, 4-digit year. All 8 digits in sequence." He looked at her. "Once the bedroom door opens, the house security system logs it. You'll have approximately 30 seconds before it registers as an anomaly rather than routine movement. After that, it flags and alerts to the panel in the west wing. Where Vivian is. Where Vivian is." He folded the floor plan. "I'll hold the corridor while you work the safe. If anyone comes, I'll give you as much time as I can. And after I have the recorder, straight down to the library. The broadcast console is on the main desk. It's the older unit, gray panel, not the newer sound system they installed for parties. Your grandfather had the modification wired into the original console specifically. You'll see a secondary input port on the left side lower panel. That's where the recorder connects." Iris looked at the floor plan for another moment, committing the layout to a part of her memory she trusted. Then she stood up. "All right," she said. They moved through this passage in single file, Marcus leading Iris close behind. The passage was narrow and low-ceilinged and smelled of old plaster and decades of disuse. Their footsteps on the wooden boards were muffled by the insulation packed into the wall cavities around them. Outside, the rain that had been threatening all evening had finally arrived, drumming against the roof of the manor above them, filling the spaces between the walls with white noise that covered their movement more effectively than silence ever could. Marcus navigated without hesitation. He had walked this passage in the dark enough times that his body had memorized it independently of his conscious mind. left at the junction, down 3 steps, right along the back of what was the second-floor sitting room. Stop at the panel. He pressed a specific point in the wall, and a section of plaster-covered board swung inward on hidden hinges opening into a linen closet that smelled of cedar and laundered fabric. They listened at the closet door for a full minute. Nothing. The corridor beyond was dark and quiet. Marcus eased the door open. He looked both ways down the hall, the disciplined look of someone who has learned that what you don't see is often more important than what you do. Then he stepped out and positioned himself against the wall facing the direction of the West Wing staircase, and nodded. Iris went to the bedroom door. The police tape from the investigation into Walter's death had been cut. Marcus had done this on a previous reconnaissance, replacing it with a facsimile that would pass casual inspection from a distance. She peeled it back carefully and eased the door open. The room beyond smelled of old medicine and the particular stillness of a space where someone had been ill for a long time and was no longer there to fill it with the sounds of illness. The curtains were drawn. The bed had been stripped to the mattress by the investigators and never remade. In the dimness from the hallway behind her, Iris could just make out the shapes of furniture. She moved to the east wall. The painting was where Marcus had described it. A large seascape, a ship fighting through a storm, rendered with the technical skill of someone who had spent considerable money on the acquisition, and no particular emotional engagement with the subject. She lifted it carefully from the wall. It was heavier than she expected, and she steadied it against her hip before setting it down. The safe was set directly into the wall behind it. Matte black, flush with the plaster, with the biometric scanner mounted above the numeric keypad. She pressed her thumb to the scanner out of instinct. Nothing, of course. She wasn't in the system. She moved to the keypad. Her birthday, month first, then day, then the 4-digit year, 8 digits in sequence. She pressed them carefully, the way you press keys when the margin for error is 0. The safe beeped once, a small contained sound that she felt rather than heard in the silent room. The lock mechanism disengaged with a soft click. The door swung open. Inside was a digital voice recorder, silver and compact, smaller than her palm. Beside it, a velvet drawstring bag that clinked softly when she touched it. Jewelry from the sound and weight of it. Things Walter had wanted her to have that had nothing to do with the legal proceedings. She took the recorder. She left the bag. There was no time for anything that didn't move the next 60 seconds forward. She turned toward the door. Douglas Crane was standing in it. He was not the exhausted, loosened collar man she had spoken with in the kitchen. He was not the tired, peripheral figure from the dinner table. The man in the doorway was composed and still and watching her with the particular attentiveness of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and is now observing its arrival. He was smiling. It was a smile she had not seen on his face before. Not warm, not weary, not the complicated expression of a man divided against himself. This was something calculated and patient. The smile of someone who has played a long game and is now approaching the board to collect. "I knew you'd come here," he said quietly. "I told Vivian you were too determined to die quietly in a cellar. I said, give her room. Let her find the journal. Let her find the book. Let her get into that room and read everything and feel what it's like to finally understand how completely surrounded she is. He tilted his head slightly. People make the most reliable mistakes when they believe they've already beaten the odds. Iris stood completely still. The recorder was in her hand. The eggs, she said, were never going to be poisoned. That was a gift to you, something specific enough to feel credible, something that would make you trust me without costing me anything real. The book. The message. Your grandfather did leave those things. I simply made sure you found them before Vivian could think to move them, which served my purposes as well as it served yours, which is the only kind of help worth offering. From behind Douglas, two figures emerged from the darkness of the corridor. Vivian, first, in a black silk robe, the pearl-handled pistol she apparently kept in her bedside drawer, held with the practiced ease of someone who was not encountering this object for the first time. Her hair was down, and her face was bare of the careful artifice she maintained during daylight hours. And without it, she looked older and colder, and somehow more genuinely dangerous, the way wild animals look more dangerous without the distance of glass between them. Sterling Aldrich behind her, still in his suit, the jacket slightly rumpled now. The first concession to the hour he had allowed himself, holding a phone and regarding the situation with the professional composure of a man who had spent 40 years making problems disappear through the correct application of legal mechanism. And past them, visible in the hallway, Marcus Reed was on the floor. Not dead. She could see his chest moving, see the slight shift of his position. That meant consciousness was present but unreliable. Blood was moving from a wound at his temple in the slow, dark way of something that has been building for a moment. He had been hit from behind. She understood. Someone had been positioned in the corridor before they arrived. Someone had anticipated their approach. Douglas had told them. This is the difficulty with alliances of convenience, Douglas said pleasantly, stepping into the room and moving to one side, making space for Vivian to enter. They're only reliable until the more convenient alliance presents itself. Vivian walked to the center of the room and stopped. The pistol was pointed at Iris with the level, unhurried aim of someone who has already made the decision and is simply completing the action. Give me the recorder. Iris looked at the gun. She looked at Vivian's face. She looked at Sterling Aldrich standing in the doorway, and at Douglas positioned to her left, and at Marcus on the floor in the corridor behind them. Then she looked at the recorder in her hand. No, she said. The word occupied the room completely. Vivian's expression did not change. I wasn't asking. I know. Iris kept her voice level. It cost her more than she let show. But if you shoot me, my hand comes down on this recorder. The button is right here. Everyone in this house hears everything. Then I'll destroy the broadcast console before it finishes playing. It's already connected. She was not connected. She had not yet been to the library. She was building this in real time, word by word, laying each stone, and trusting the ones she'd already placed to hold. Your father had the connection routed through the house wiring, not through the console hardware. Destroying the console won't stop the transmission. Sterling Aldrich spoke for the first time. That's not possible. I reviewed every modification made to that system. Nothing was wired into the house circuitry. Are you certain? Iris looked at him directly. Because Walter spent 9 months planning this. 9 months knowing he was being poisoned, knowing exactly who was doing it. knowing what you would do when you understood what the will contained. A man who spent 9 months building something this careful. Did he really leave you only one way to be stopped? She watched Sterling's face. She watched the calculation moving behind his eyes. The professional instinct of a lawyer who had spent decades identifying the weakest point in any argument now working against his own certainty. "She's bluffing," Vivian said. "Probably," Iris agreed. "But you're not certain. And if I'm not bluffing and you shoot me and that recording goes out to every state police frequency in the county, that's the end of everything. Not just the money. Not just the company. All of it. Your freedom. His." She indicated Aldrich with a slight movement of her head. "Everything you've spent 20 years protecting." The room held its position for a moment. All 4 of them motionless. The rain hammering the windows. The recording in Iris's hand. The gun level and steady in Vivian's. And then the bedroom door, which had been standing open behind Sterling Aldrich, was filled with Preston Crane. He looked like a man who had come apart at the seams over the course of an evening, and was only now appearing in public with the evidence of it on full display. His clothes were disheveled, his dark hair matted with what might have been sweat, his eyes moving around the room with the rapid, unfocused quality of someone whose internal landscape had recently undergone significant rearrangement. In his right hand, he carried an antique oil lamp from the hallway. The kind that existed in this house as decoration, as testament to a certain aesthetic of old wealth filled with lamp oil that had been refreshed regularly by staff who maintained the fiction of its utility. In his left hand, he held a silver lighter lid open thumb on the wheel. "Nobody is taking anything," he said. His voice had the cracked, high-wire quality of something that had already crossed the point of no return and was only now noticing the drop below. "Not her. Not the police. Not any of you. Preston." Vivian's voice changed registers completely. The flat authority gone replaced by something softer and more careful. The voice reserved for situations where power alone wasn't the right instrument. "Put that down. We can handle this." "Handle it." He laughed, and it was a sound that didn't belong in any category of normal human expression. "You've been handling things my whole life, Mother. You handled Grandfather. You handled Aunt Claire. You handled everything, and you told me it was for us, for the family, for what we were building." His eyes went to Iris and stayed there. "And then she walks in the door, and it turns out we were building it for her." "Preston, if I can't have this house," he said, and his voice dropped to something almost quiet, which was somehow worse than the unhinged register that had preceded it, "then it doesn't exist. It burns. All of it. The portraits and the books and the secrets and every room she's walked through." He raised the lamp. "Preston, don't—" He threw it. The lamp described a short arc across the room and struck the heavy velvet curtains beside the fireplace. The oil caught immediately. Not an explosion, but a rapid unfurling of flame, the curtains going from fabric to fire in a single continuous motion, the heat arriving in the room before anyone had processed what they were seeing. Preston flicked the lighter and threw that too. For approximately 1 second, everyone in the room stood in the orange light of the burning curtains and did nothing because the mind requires a moment to accept that the situation it was preparing for has been replaced by an entirely different situation. that it was not preparing for. Then everything moved at once. Vivienne turned toward Preston, the pistol dropping to her side, something crossing her face that was not the cold calculation Iris had seen every day in this house, but something older and more fundamental. A mother looking at her child and not recognizing what she was seeing. Douglas moved toward the door, the elegant self-interest of his position asserting itself immediately. If the building was on fire, Douglas Crane's priority was Douglas Crane. Sterling Aldrich reached for his phone, and Iris ran. She went through the doorway past Aldrich's reaching arm, stepping over Marcus's legs without stopping because stopping was not an option. Behind her, she could hear the fire taking the bookcase, the particular sound of old wood going fast and hungry, the roar that follows the initial silence of ignition. She ran down the corridor. The smoke was already beginning to work its way up from the east wing, thinning as it spread through the upper floor, but thickening near its source. She could feel the heat behind her as she hit the main staircase and went down 2 steps at a time, hand barely touching the banister. The entry hall, the corridor to the library. She had walked this route every day since arriving at Ashford Point, and her feet knew it independently of her attention, which was currently occupied with the recorder in her hand, and the distance remaining and the sound of the fire beginning to say something serious on the floor above. She hit the library doors with both hands and they swung inward. The room was dark except for the glow from the fireplace at the far end, which seemed almost absurdly ordinary given what was happening 2 floors above it. She crossed to the main desk, scanning its surface in the fireplace light, until she found the broadcast console older than the rest of the room's technology. Gray-paneled set, slightly apart from the other equipment in the way of things that have a different function than what surrounds them. She found the secondary input port on the lower left panel, exactly where Marcus had described it. She plugged in the recorder. She found the volume control and turned it to its maximum position. The library doors crashed open behind her. Vivienne was there, and the silk robe now had a scorched edge at the hem, and her hair had come entirely undone. And the gun was back in her hand, and she was no longer the composed, calculating woman who had spoken through an iron door with the patience of someone who had already won. She was something more immediate than that, stripped of the performance, the strategy, the careful management of appearance. What remained was a woman who had spent 20 years building something and was watching it come apart in a single night, and who had decided that the only remaining action available to her was the one she was currently pointing at Iris. Step away from that console. Iris did not step away. If you shoot me, she said, my hand falls on this button. Everyone hears everything. Then I'll destroy the console. Destroy it. Iris held Vivienne's gaze. The connection runs through the house wiring. It plays regardless. This time she was not bluffing. She had plugged the recorder into the port. Whatever happened to the console, now the signal was already running through the modification Walter had paid to have installed 3 months before his death, through the wiring of the house he had built 40 years ago, to the frequency that the Maine State Police monitored as part of their standard emergency communications protocol. It was already done. She pressed play. The voice that filled the library was old and tired and unmistakably Walter Ashford. The voice of a man who was ill and knew it, and was spending what he had left on something he considered worth spending it on. Vivienne, please. We need to talk about what's been happening. What you've been doing is wrong. Not just legally, it's wrong. People have died because of decisions made in this house. Then Vivian's voice, younger sounding on the recording, or perhaps just more certain, the voice of someone who had not yet begun to feel the ground shifting beneath them. There's nothing to discuss, Father. You're changing the will tomorrow. You're going to give everything to a girl you've never met. A girl Claire abandoned, and in doing so, you're going to destroy everything I've built over 20 years. I won't allow it. It's not yours to allow or prevent. This company, this house, what we've built here has cost things it shouldn't have cost. I'm going to make that right. I'm going to go to the authorities. I'm going to establish compensation funds. I'm going to tell the truth. You're tired, Father. You're confused. You need to rest. Just close your eyes. Let me handle everything, like I always have. Sounds of struggle. Not violence, slower and more terrible than violence, the sounds of an old man being overwhelmed by the simple fact of physical weakness, of resistance, becoming impossible not because of force, but because of exhaustion. Because of a body that had been made unreliable by 6 months of something introduced into his food and his drink, by the hands of someone he had raised. Gasping, fabric, silence. Then Vivian's voice speaking to someone else in the room. It's done, Sterling. He's gone. Make sure the death certificate reads cardiac arrest. Nothing else. Nothing ambiguous. And the girl, the granddaughter, will deal with her when the time comes. The way we dealt with Claire. The recording ended. Through the smoke beginning to filter down from the upper floors, through the library windows still intact, against the November night, through the stone walls of Ashford Point Manor, Iris heard sirens. Not one siren. Not the single note of a local response. Many sirens coming from multiple directions, growing louder with the speed of vehicles already moving fast before they received the call. Because they had received the call the moment she pressed play through the frequency Walter had prepared through the modification, installed quietly and carefully by a man who had spent the last months of his life making sure that even if everything else went wrong, this one thing would work. Vivian had not moved. The gun was still in her hand. She was looking at Iris with an expression that had passed through fury and emerged on the other side of it into something that had no performance left in it at all. Just a woman in a burned robe standing in her father's library listening to her own voice. Confessed to his murder through speakers mounted in every room of the house he had built. How? Vivian said. It was barely a word. He spent 9 months, Iris said, knowing what you were doing to him, knowing what you'd done to my mother, spending whatever he had left to make sure that when the time came there was no version of this where you walked away. You've destroyed everything. Iris looked at her, really looked at her the way she had looked at the oil portraits in the entry hall on her first day, trying to read faces that had been rendered by someone paid to make them look important. She thought about the files in the room below, the photographs of barrels going into clear water, the medical reports from villages that had been quietly poisoned so that the numbers on a balance sheet would be larger than they would otherwise have been. You destroyed it, Iris said, a long time ago. I just made sure people knew. The library windows shattered inward as the first firefighters came through, not breaking in from outside, but clearing the already cracked glass to create a safe access point. The professional decisiveness of people who had assessed the situation from the exterior and made their decisions. Cold air and controlled chaos entered the room simultaneously. Voices, radio communications, the sound of the larger operation organizing itself around the building. Uniformed officers came through the library doors. Vivian's hand dropped. The pistol hit the carpet without drama, which was somehow the most revealing thing she had done all evening. The absence of a final gesture. The simple surrender of someone from whom the will to perform had finally departed. She stood in the ruined room while an officer approached her and did not resist the handcuffs, and did not speak and did not look at Iris again. Sterling Aldrich had been found in the east corridor by the first officers, through the main entrance attempting to reach his car through a side door that Marcus recovered enough to stand, one hand pressed against the wound at his temple, had quietly blocked 20 minutes earlier, when he had regained consciousness and assessed the situation with the methodical calm of someone who has woken up in difficult circumstances before. Douglas Crane was in the formal sitting room, cooperative and voluble, already explaining to the detective beside him the specific and comprehensive ways in which he had been a victim of his wife's decisions, rather than a participant in them. The detective was writing things down, with the patience of someone who had heard this particular story in various forms many times. Preston Crane was found in the East Wing corridor on the floor. The fire he had started consuming the rooms around him while he sat with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up staring at nothing. The paramedics who reached him reported that he was conscious but unresponsive to standard questions, that he appeared to be in significant psychological distress, and that he kept repeating almost inaudibly something about fire and money and a girl who should never have come home. The fire crews worked through the night. They saved the main body of the house, the entry hall, the west wing, the original stone structure that Walter had built into the cliff 4 decades ago. The east wing was lost. The fire Preston had started consumed the bedroom, where Iris had opened the safe, the adjoining rooms, and moved down through the floor to take the library where 3 generations of Ashford secrets had been kept on shelves behind glass that was now gone. But the truth had left the building before the fire reached it. It had gone out over a radio frequency monitored by the Maine State Police. It had been recorded by the dispatch system that logged all emergency transmissions. It had been heard by 11 officers in 7 vehicles who were already en route before the fire was called in, and it had been preserved in the digital memory of a system that would be subpoenaed within 48 hours by the State Attorney General's office, which had been waiting quietly, carefully, with the patience of an institution that understands the value of timing for exactly this kind of evidence for the better part of a year. Walter Ashford had not mailed files to the FBI. He had done something more durable. He had made the evidence part of a legal proceeding the moment it was broadcast, witnessed and received by law enforcement on a monitored frequency. He had made it impossible to suppress. He had spent 9 months dying, and he had spent those 9 months making himself useful on the cliff behind what remained of Ashford Point Manor, as the first gray light of a November dawn began to separate the ocean from the sky. Iris stood with a silver emergency blanket around her shoulders that a paramedic had insisted upon, and looked at the Atlantic. She had lived inside a single day that had contained more of everything. More fear, more grief, more discovery, more danger than the previous 18 years of her life combined. She was scraped and cold, and her knees had not entirely stopped shaking. She was the sole heir to an estate valued at nearly $4 billion. and she was wearing a second-hand dress that belonged to at least 4 other girls before her. She was thinking about her mother, not the Claire Ashford of the photographs. The laughing woman on this same cliff with the wind in her hair, and the whole world apparently still available to her. She was thinking about Claire Calloway, the woman who had remade herself in a city where nobody knew her name, who had built a life out of nothing with a child she hadn't planned for, and circumstances she hadn't chosen, who had done every ordinary, extraordinary thing that people do when they have decided that survival is worth the effort, who had driven to work on a wet September morning and encountered on a stretch of highway south of Portland the consequence of having known too much about the wrong people. She had run. Iris had understood that reading the journal. She had understood it completely. You do not ask of a 22-year-old woman alone and pregnant and genuinely frightened that she be braver than the situation permitted. But she had run. And the thing she ran from had eventually run faster. Iris was 18. She had run toward it instead. She reached into her pocket and found the 2 things she had carried since she'd left the bedroom. The brass key, green with age, that had opened a door to the truth about her family, and the folded letter in Walter's unsteady hand. She held them for a moment in the cold morning air. Then she heard footsteps on the grass behind her. Marcus Reed came to stand beside her, a piece of white gauze taped to his temple, his jacket gone, his hands in his pockets. He looked at the ocean with the unhurried patience of someone who has stood in difficult places and learned to be present in them without being consumed by them. They stood in silence for a while. "The State Attorney General's office called an hour ago," he said eventually. "They've been building a case around Project Leviathan for 11 months. They had corporate records, shipping logs enough to establish the operation existed, not enough to connect it to specific individuals with decision-making authority. The recording provides that connection. When does it go to trial? The AG wants to move quickly. Vivian Aldrich, the chemical company executives who contracted the disposals. It'll be the largest environmental fraud prosecution in New England in 30 years. He paused. "They'll need you to testify." "I know." Another silence. The ocean below continued its ancient argument with the granite. "Your grandfather also mailed a full copy of the archive room documents to the Attorney General's office," Marcus said. "Delivered 8 days before he died. They've been sitting in a sealed evidence file waiting for the right moment to be unsealed." He looked at her. "He didn't leave you one path. He left you several. He wanted to make sure that even if every other thing went wrong, the truth was already somewhere it couldn't be taken back." Iris absorbed this. The image of Walter Ashford in his final weeks, sick, careful, spending his diminishing hours on the architecture of a justice he would not live to see delivered, sat in her chest in a complicated way that she suspected would take years to fully understand. "He never met me," she said. "No. He spent 9 months and whatever he had left of himself doing all of this, and he never met me. He knew your mother," Marcus said. "He watched her leave, and he spent 20 years being too proud to bring her back. And then she was gone. And the only thing left of her was you somewhere in a city he knew the name of, in a building he could have driven to in 2 hours if he'd allowed himself to." He was quiet for a moment. "I think the last 9 months were him trying to do finally what he should have done a long time ago." The sun was fully risen now, hidden behind the cloud cover. but present in the way that November suns are present on the Maine coast, diffuse and indirect, pushing light through cloud, rather than delivering it directly, illuminating without warming. The manor above them was marked by the black vertical scar of the east wing, scaffolded already by the fire crews, a wound that would take time to address. "I'm going to establish a trust," Iris said. "The first allocation goes to environmental remediation in every area Project Leviathan affected. The Caribbean, the Pacific sites, the coastal communities in Central America. It's going to take years and it's probably not going to be enough. But it's where I start. And the company can become what it should have been. Legitimate shipping. Clean operations. If the people who've worked there for 20 years had no knowledge of what was happening alongside their work, they shouldn't lose their jobs because of decisions made over their heads." She paused. "If they did know they're part of the prosecution." The house. She looked up at Ashford Point Manor. The stone walls. The remaining windows. The towers and chimneys that rose above the cliff. The way they had risen for 40 years, indifferent to everything that had happened inside them. "I'm going to build something here," she said. "I don't know exactly what yet. Something that's open. Something that has windows that let light in instead of keeping people from seeing what's inside." She thought about the children at Hargrove House, the younger ones who had started sleeping in pairs for warmth during that January when the heat failed, who had looked to a 12-year-old girl to tell them it was going to be all right. Something that matters. She reached into her pocket one more time and withdrew the 2 photographs she had been carrying since she took them from her mother's room on the first night. The first was the one from her cardboard box, Claire young and laughing, holding a baby, the Atlantic behind her, the world apparently still possible. The second was the photograph Sterling Aldrich had shown her in the foyer of Hargrove House. The wider version, the one that included the old man standing beside her mother, with his hand on her shoulder and something in his eyes that had taken Iris a long time to identify, and had turned out to be love of the complicated, damaged, insufficient, and genuine kind. She had been angry at this man. She had been angry at him in the specific way you are angry at someone who had the power to do something important and chose not to for a long time, until finally the cost of not doing it became larger than the cost of doing it. She thought she would probably be angry at him in some portion of herself for a long time still. But he had spent his last 9 months trying. "I found the truth," she said, speaking to the photographs and to the ocean below, and to whatever part of the dead could still receive the words of the living. "I made them answer for what they did. And I'm going to spend however long it takes trying to repair what was broken. Not because it fixes anything, it doesn't fix anything, but because the alternative is letting the damage be the last word. And I won't let it be." The wind came off the Atlantic and moved across the clifftop, and through her hair, and past her and continued inland as it always did, as it had done against this particular configuration of rock and grass for far longer than the house above them had existed. Marcus said nothing. He understood in the way that people who have seen serious things sometimes understand that some moments are not improved by speech. After a while, Iris put the photographs back in her pocket. "The Attorney General's office," she said. "What time do they need me?" 10 o'clock. "Then I need to clean up and change." She turned from the ocean and looked up at what remained of the house Walter Ashford had built on the edge of this cliff, into which she had walked as a stranger 2 weeks ago, and which she was now in every legal and personal sense responsible for. And after that, She said, "We have a great deal of work to do." She walked back across the clifftop grass toward the manor, her worn shoes wet with dew. The emergency blanket still around her shoulders, moving with the particular quality of someone who has decided where they are going and sees no reason to delay arriving there. She was 18 years old. She had no money of her own, no family she had chosen, no map for what came next. She had a $4 billion estate that had been built on poison, a company that needed to become something different than it had been, a house that needed to become something it had never been, and a truth that had finally been spoken in a room where it could not be taken back. She was Iris Calloway, daughter of Claire, granddaughter of Walter, heir to everything they had left her, including the parts that were broken, which were considerable, and the parts that still held, which were enough to build from. She was not a victim. She was not a ghost in someone else's house. She was home, and there was work to do.